Chapter 9 The Hiding Place. They came to a tiny deserted village by the sea. There were 5 little gray houses nestled in the spaces between the rocks, which were also gray. Here even the sea had turned gray as the summer day faded, and clouds, leaden and heavy with rain, hung over this village where no one lived. This was a good hiding place. Here was only abandonment and silence and the grayest desolation. "Oscar, where are the people who used to live in the houses?" Rasmus asked. Oscar was sitting on a rock. He had taken off his shoes and socks, and with a look of relief on his face was spreading his toes out in the coolness of the evening. They immigrated to America, the whole bunch of them. Why didn't they want to live here any longer? Their life was probably too poor and miserable and gray in these houses, not enough fish in the sea, and those little patches of land probably couldn't produce enough to live on. Rasmus nodded. That was something he understood. He knew full well how terrible it was to be poor, but they certainly had good swimming here, he said as he looked down. Into the transparent water whirling around the rocks. They probably wouldn't find anything like that where they were going. "Oh, I suppose they could swim in the clearest lake in Minnesota if they wanted to," said Oscar. Rasmus smiled. The clearest lake in Minnesota. That sounded so picturesque. He would like to see it sometime as well as all the other lakes and mountains and rivers in the world. He tried to imagine those people walking around over there looking for the clearest lake in Minnesota. Perhaps they were thinking of the cliffs at home and wondering if anyone was living in their little gray houses by the sea. "I'm going to take a look," he said, and ran over to the nearest cottage. He wanted to see if there were any remains of the Minnesota travelers in there. Through a broken window he was able to peek into a miserable little cottage with ceiling beams blackened by smoke and a sooty open fireplace. It must have been ages since anyone had made a fire and cooked over it. Rasmus felt so sorry for houses where no one lived. They seemed so lonesome, as if they were longing for people to come and make themselves at home, build a fire in the fireplace, put on the coffee pot, and make breakfast for their children. He brushed away a few glass splinters from the windowsill and climbed in. There were dead leaves and other rubbish lying around, and the floor creaked under his bare feet. He went to the fireplace and peeked up under the hood. When had the last fire been made here? Oh well, he would never know, but once this cottage had been a real home. How wonderful if it would be again, and he could climb in and live in it. But if it were a real home with people in it, he would, of course, only be allowed to stand at the kitchen doors, as tramps usually do. They would have their own children, and wouldn't need a boy from an orphanage, but it was nice to pretend just the same. He ran to the window. "Oscar, this is where we are going to stay," he shouted. "Yes, at least for the night," Oscar called back from the cliff. "For a while I want to keep out of sight, and besides, I'm sore at everybody." Rasmus was having a good time in the Minnesota immigrant's empty house. He ran up and down the stairs and out of the porch and kitchen and the tiny rooms. He was wondering which house to choose and finally decided on the one that was in the most sheltered position and the least ravaged by wind and water. It had a narrow little kitchen and a tiny room just like the other houses, and it also had a steep, rickety stairway leading up to a miserable attic and attic room. But it was a house, and they could make believe that it was a real home. He could almost imagine that Oscar was his father, and if he really gave free rein to his imagination, he could imagine that Oscar was a rich grocer and not a tramp at all. Unfortunately, there was no grocer's wife, but he could pretend that she had gone on a trip, perhaps to Minnesota, and would soon come back home carrying a lace parasol and wearing a blue hat with feathers. She would be very pretty, and she would bring him and Oscar fine presents. Then the three of them would live in the house and be rich, very rich. But a home has to have furniture, tables and sofas and rugs and curtains. Like Miss Hedberg's, Rasmus wished for furniture so intensely that it seemed as if it would rise from the floor. But to imagine mahogany tables and sofas upholstered in gay prints in this bare room was a superhuman feat, even for Rasmus. Then he remembered having seen a dump at the roadside a bit farther down, and ran over there. People throw so much stuff on a dump. Maybe there was something he could use for furniture. He came back with an empty sugar crate, a couple of margarine boxes, and a whole lot of other things he had picked up. The sugar crate would make a fine table after he had washed it off in the sea, but first the cottage had to be swept. He broke off a branch from a tree, and with that he cleared out as much as he could of the trash. Then he brought his table in. On it he put an empty bottle which made a fine vase for the almond blossoms he had picked. The margarine boxes had turned into chairs. Rugs and curtains he just had to imagine. Oscar had gone off into the woods to find spruce branches for them to sleep on, and when he came back Rasmus called out to him, "Over here with the bedding." Oscar didn't have much imagination, but he still realized that he was coming into a very well-furnished room. He stood in the doorway, his arms filled with fragrant spruce boughs, and wiped his feet. "I'd better clean off my hoofs before I come in," he said. "I just tell me where you want me to put the swansdown bolsters." "Put them over there," said Rasmus, pointing to a corner of the room. Oscar obediently spread out the spruce branches to form a bed. Rasmus was very pleased with the effect. The green brightened up the room considerably. They could use it as both a rug and a bed, and it made the whole room cozy. "It's lucky you got everything in order," said Oscar, "because it's going to pour any minute." Almost before the words were out of his mouth, the rain came down in torrents, splashing against the broken window panes and pounding on the roof. The room had quite suddenly become dark, but Rasmus felt at home. The rain made it still cozier. "Should we perhaps have something to eat?" said Rasmus hesitatingly. They had eaten something in a hurry at the roadside, but not enough. Besides, they had to make use of their table. Oscar still had most of the supplies they had bought at Holtzmann's, and he laid out the bread and butter and cheese and ham and salami on the sugar crate. Each of them sat down on a margarine box, eating contentedly and listening to the rain. Rasmus was thinking, "Never will I forget this, the wonderful time we had when we were eating and it was pouring outside." He couldn't tell Rasmus that he was pretending that they had a real home, and that Oscar was a prosperous grocer, with a wife in a blue hat with feathers, who was away on a trip. But he looked longingly at his companion over a salami sandwich and said, "Suppose you were my father and we lived together in a house." Yes, wouldn't that be just dandy, a tramp for a father? Rasmus was quite quiet for a few minutes. It was true that he wanted his parents to be rich and attractive. A tramp wasn't exactly what he had in mind. Oh, if Oscar had only been a wealthy, handsome grocer! The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. The two vagabonds had finished their supper and now made themselves comfortable on their spruce branches in the corner. Oscar took the piece of blanket which he used to wrap around the accordion and put it over Rasmus. My father thought Rasmus is wrapping a red satin comforter around me, because my mother is in Minnesota and can't be with me. She is bathing in the clearest lake and is writing letters home saying, "I'll be coming home soon and I'll have a lot of fine presents with me. Tuck Rasmus in well at night in the red satin comforter. I'll be home soon." It was getting darker outside. The wind, which had been holding its breath during the rain, now came from the sea in gusts. A storm was coming up. The waves splashed against the rocks more violently, and the wind was tugging at the slender birches outside. Many strange sounds were beginning to come to life in the cottage. From the broken windows came peeping, whining noises. Somewhere a door banged without stopping until finally Oscar got annoyed. Will that darned door ever stop banging? A body who is sleeping here won't have any trouble staying awake. Rasmus didn't like all the creaking and squeaking. He was afraid. With wide open eyes he lay in his corner, staring out into the darkness like a frightened animal. "Maybe there are ghosts here," he whispered. "If the ghosts come and get us." But Oscar wasn't afraid. "If you see any ghost, just tell them that they can go and jump in the sea. Otherwise, God's best friend will come and make ghost hash of them." But Rasmus wasn't reassured. Aunt Olga in the kitchen once saw a dog who had no head and sparks of fire came from his throat. Oscar yawned. Aunt Olga in the kitchen had no head either, it seems. There are no such things as ghosts. "There certainly are," said Rasmus. "Do you know what Big Peter says? He says that if you run around the church 12 times at midnight, they will come and take you. I think they would be right to take you. Why on earth should you be running around the church in the middle of the night? Anyone would have to be pretty weak in the head to do that, and then he would have only himself to blame." Oscar didn't want to talk about ghosts any more. He wanted to sleep. Rasmus was sleepy too, although he had had a nap in the sand hole, but all that sighing and squeaking kept him awake. Oscar was already snoring, but Rasmus lay there tense and listening. Then he heard voices. Yes, it was definitely voices he heard. Old gray houses may sigh and creak in the night wind, but real voices could only mean ghosts. With a pitiful cry he threw himself on Oscar. "Oscar, now the ghosts are coming. I hear them talking." Oscar sat up among the spruce branches, wide awake. Talking? Who is talking? He was on the alert, listening instantly. Yes, Rasmus was right. Someone was talking close by. "Dear me, that means the sheriff again," Oscar groaned. He crept up to the window on his knees and peered out into the darkness. Rasmus was behind him, frightened out of his wits, and biting his nails in desperation. "I'm for taking the dough and beating it," a voice was saying. A man was standing right outside the window, and it didn't sound like the sheriff. "You'd better let me handle this," another voice said, and that voice Rasmus recognized. He would know Hilding Lift's voice among 1,000 others. Rasmus held on to Oscar's arm. Lift and Leander were even worse than ghosts and sheriffs. Now they were coming in. Help! They were in the kitchen, and Rasmus heard the floor creaking under their steps. What were they doing here in the middle of the night, and was there no place in the world where he and Oscar could get away from robbers? The door between the kitchen and Rasmus' finely furnished room wasn't closed. There was a broad crack through which they could hear every word that was said in the kitchen. "I think it's dangerous to wait any longer," said the voice, which belonged to Leander. "I want to get out of here." "No, no," said Liff, "we mustn't get jittery and spoil everything. It wouldn't be a good idea to skip out just when the old lady has lost her necklace. We'll stay the rest of the week at the inn. That will look good. Our conscience is clear, you see. We've never been to Sandow, otherwise we wouldn't be staying at the inn a few miles from there for almost 2 weeks. You see the point." "Yes, I see it all right," said Leander, "because you've said it at least 14 times before, but I would like to take the dough and get out, because I think we'll be sitting here with our good conscience until we're caught, but good." "It's going to be the way I said," said Liff. "We'll grab the dough on Saturday morning and then calmly take the 2 o'clock train, and no one will get any funny ideas about the necklace or anything." It sounded as if the men were taking up some loose boards in the kitchen, and then they heard Liff saying, in a voice that purred, "It does my soul good to see so much dough." There was silence for a while, and then he continued, "My guess is that the necklace is also worth 5,000 or 6,000. "I'd like to be rid of it," said Leander. "Sandow worked out okay, but the business with Anastina was no good. It's all right with me if you pick up with one of your discarded girlfriends, but to do business with women, that's signing your own death warrant." "Are you scared?" said Liff with a sneer. "I'm not scared, it's just that I don't like this one bit. Suppose the old lady revives." "She won't. She has lived long enough as it is." "If she revives," I said, "suppose she comes to and tells what happened, and the sheriff gives Anastina the 3rd degree about that tramp. That stupid Anastina, she should never have blamed it on the tramp, because if the sheriff finds out she has lied there, it won't take more than 5 minutes before he gets the truth out of her. Then it will only take 5 minutes more, and we'll be stuck for Sandow too." "Take it easy," said Liff. "You've been nagging about that all day, and I'm sick and tired of it. Anastina isn't that dumb, and besides, the old lady won't be talking any more," Leander growled. "And we sure have a good hiding place for the dough," Liff continued. "This is much better than digging the stuff down in the woods. It's easy to find, and in a place people would never think of looking. If you just don't find your way here by yourself before Saturday," said Leander sourly. Liff flared up. "Don't you trust me?" Leander laughed a dry, harsh laugh. "Don't you trust me?" said the fox as he bit the head off the hen. "Yes, I trust you about the way you trust me." Rasmus dug his nails into Oscar's arm. This was almost more than he could take. It was ghastly to think that there were people who wanted to do away with others, and unbearable to have those horrible characters so close, only a few feet away from them. He wished himself as far away as possible. Still, the adventurous part of him wanted to stay behind and see what would happen next. He heard them banging around with the boards again. Now they were probably hiding the money, but just wait until they had left. "Let's go," said Leander. "Okay," said Liff. Rasmus was already heaving a deep sigh of relief, but then Liff said something that made his blood run cold. "I'm going to take a look around and see if I could find the pipe I forgot here last time. I think I put it on the windowsill in there." And there could only mean the room where Oscar and Rasmus were sitting huddled close together in their corner. Rasmus pressed himself still closer to Oscar, so terrified that his head was swimming. He felt the muscles in Oscar's arms become tense, and knew he was getting ready to fight. But the gangsters had guns. This was really the end for them. There was the sound of quick footsteps. The door was opened, and the light from a flashlight fell across the floor. In the middle of the room was Rasmus' fine furniture, but the light quickly swept over the sugar crate. The gangster didn't seem to think there was anything peculiar about its being there. He wasn't at all surprised, but probably would be when he caught sight of Oscar and Rasmus. They pressed themselves still closer into their corner and waited. Oscar's muscles became still tenser. But then, "Here's the pipe," said Leander's voice from the kitchen. "It's right here on the windowsill." Liff turned around and went back. The threatening beam of light faded, and he left the room without noticing the two in the corner. This was a pure miracle, but not even the darkest corner was really dark. But two tramps probably aren't noticed by someone looking for a pipe. "That one sure was wearing blinders," said Rasmus, when the gangsters had disappeared into the windy night and he dared to talk again. "Come on," said Oscar, picking up his flashlight. "Now we'll take a look at that good hiding place which is so easy to find. This is going to be very interesting." They went into the kitchen, and Rasmus was wild with excitement. In his imagination he saw a huge pit filled with gold and silver coins. Oscar's flashlight traveled over the floorboards. He examined each one and tried with his foot to see if it was secure. "This is it." Eagerly he loosened a board next to the stove. He loosened another one and pointed his flashlight into the hole. A square piece of earth underneath had been dug out, and in its place was a big package well wrapped in oilcloth. Oscar opened it. "Ah," was all Rasmus could say. Piles of bills of large denominations were stacked in neat rows. The whole payroll from the Sandow factory. There were no gold and silver coins, but Rasmus could tell, by Oscar's almost frightened expression, that this was money too. "I didn't think there was so much of this stuff in the whole world," said Oscar. There were also a necklace and a gold chain with a pendant set with huge green stones. It was the most beautiful thing Rasmus had ever seen in his life, but of course he hadn't seen many beautiful things. A great wave of relief and pleasure came over him. Now Miss Hedberg will get her necklace back if she is still alive. Oscar let the gold chain glide between his fingers. "I hope I'll have a chance to sing 'Every Forest Has Its Spring' for her once more," he said. Rasmus was elated. "Tomorrow we'll go to the sheriff with the money and to Miss Hedberg with the necklace." "No, we don't. We have to be clever about this." "But what else can we do?" said Rasmus. "I'm not going to stick my nose into that beehive again, with lying maids and all the commotion and 'What did you do on Thursday, Oscar?' No, sir. What we'll do is hide the stuff in a different place and write a new note to the sheriff saying, 'Please pick up the money before it's too late.' Then you and I will hit the road again and let the sheriff take care of the rest. That's what he's paid for. I haven't signed on as a sort of sheriff's assistant." Oscar began to fill his rucksack with the stacks of bills. "If the sheriff catches me walking around with a whole bank on my back, I'll probably get life." He took the necklace and playfully put it around Rasmus' neck. "You're going to be real fancy for once in your life. Now you look like King Solomon himself in all his glory, except a bit more freckled." In the light of the flashlight, King Solomon stood there, all skinny arms and legs with emeralds around his neck. "And straight hair," added Rasmus. He tugged at the necklace. He didn't want to have it on, but there was no time to take it off, because there they were again, the voices. Chapter 10. The Chase. "Quick," whispered Oscar. "Let's get out of here fast." They ran toward the porch, but it was too late. Now the voices were close, right outside the door. There was no escape that way. The attic. Oscar pushed Rasmus ahead of him up the narrow, steep stairs where Rasmus had been skipping up and down so gaily before. Now he stumbled and felt sick, and terrified of the two who were just now opening the outer door and coming into the dark house. Oscar and Rasmus stopped dead in the stairway. They didn't dare move and hardly dared breathe, afraid that even a breath might give them away. Rasmus stared in panic at the two nightmarish black shadows down there. Oh, how he detested them! No, you are right. There were no boxes here the last time. That was Lift's voice. Now he was opening the door to the kitchen. And still you don't have the wits to speak up when you see a whole box factory, said Leander accusingly. The boxes didn't get there by themselves. That much I should think you could figure out. I didn't think of it until afterward, said Liff. You know how it is sometimes. You see something but you don't see it, and then in a while, bang, it just dawns on you. Where on earth did those boxes come from? See and don't see. We can't afford such talk in our business, but now we are getting the dough out of here. Ha, that's what you think, said Rasmus gleefully to himself. Despite his fear, he felt triumphant, but it was all wiped out the next moment with the cry of rage from the kitchen and the furious roar of Liff. After them fast, they can't be far away. They went tearing out like bloodhounds in search of the unknown enemy who had taken their loot, intending to demolish him when they laid their hands on him. But suddenly Liff stopped. Wait, first we have to see if they are still in the house. There's no one down here, maybe up in the attic. He dashed up the stairs right into Oscar's fist. With a moan he fell backward into Leander's arms. Rasmus moaned, too, as he stood behind Oscar's broad back, because he saw Leander pull out his terrible gun, and heard him say, in a voice shaking with rage, "If you move, I'll shoot." Now Liff had got to his feet again. The beam of his flashlight caught the two on the stairs, and he gasped when he saw King Solomon in all his glory. The kid is wearing the necklace. The robbers stared as if they hardly believed their eyes. "Run, Rasmus," shouted Oscar. He stood there, broad and tremendous, blocking the narrow stairs. "Run," he shouted in a thundering voice. Rasmus ran. Like a rat being chased, he ran the rest of the way up the stairs and across the miserable attic room, where the wind was shaking the empty window frames, so they rattled. Outside the window was the roof of the kitchen. He heaved himself over the window ledge. Climbing on roofs was something he was good at, and jumping too. It was a leap of about a dozen feet to the ground, but he could have jumped from a church steeple if it had been necessary. He landed on his knees and felt pain, but he didn't have time to stop. He was a terrified rat pursued by the cat. He already heard Liff coming around the corner to block him, and he ran as if his life were at stake. In fact, he knew that it was. Oh, you Minnesota travelers, if you only knew what is happening in your gray house by the sea tonight. A terrified boy with emeralds around his neck is running between the houses with a robber hot on his trail. There is no one to help him. The gray houses are quiet and deserted. The windows are dead and silent. No friendly door is opened in the windy night. No kind voice calls through an open window. "Come in here, we'll hide you." He is completely on his own, this barefoot boy in the striped orphanage shirt and patched homespun pants, with an emerald necklace around his neck, running seeking protection behind the nearest house. This one once belonged to Peter Anderson, but the boy, so frantically running here, many years after Peter Anderson's departure, doesn't know that. He stands still for a second, his heart pounding violently, trying to figure out in what direction to run. He doesn't have a second to lose because his pursuer is coming around the corner. The pursuer's hair is standing straight. Up in the wind, and he is no longer a fine gentleman in a straw hat, but a desperate gangster who has to get hold of the boy no matter what. Rasmus runs in wild panic. He is fast, but his pursuer has longer legs and can run still faster. The pursuer is gaining on him. When Rasmus glances around, he can see those long legs moving with terrifying speed and the hair standing straight up in the wind. Next to Peter Anderson's house is Carl Nelson's, surrounded by a cluster of sheds. Rasmus stops behind Carl Nelson's old carpenter shed. He stands motionless, waiting for his enemy to pounce on him. Here he comes, but he races by. He doesn't notice the boy pressing himself close to the wall. Rasmus has a few seconds to catch his breath, but the cat discovers the rat again. Liff sees his prey on the way back to Peter Anderson's house and goes after him. Rasmus runs, panting. He has a good head start, but in a contest with Liff he can't possibly win. He has to find a hiding place quickly, Peter Anderson's house. He runs in there, but what sort of hiding place can he find in a completely empty house? There is a woodbin. Many generations of children have played hide-and-seek here. They have crept into the woodbin and pulled the lid down over themselves, but no one has ever been in there in such a panic, waiting for a pair of cruel hands to come and pull him out from his hiding place. Now the trap has snapped shut on the rat. If Liff finds him here, he is done for. Here he comes. Rasmus hears his steps in the kitchen, terribly close. Any minute he will lift the lid, but most likely Liff has never played hide-and-seek, and doesn't know anything about woodbins, because he dashes into the room and up the stairs to the attic. He knows the boy must be somewhere in this house, but Rasmus is already out of the woodbin and outside the house again. He hopes that he has fooled Liff this time. He prays frantically that he will not be discovered. No such luck. Through the attic window, Liff sees the barefoot lad running across the yard, his legs moving like drumsticks. With 2 leaps down the stairs, the gangster is after him, relentless as fate. The chase continues along the old village street. In former times, peaceful ox carts trundled along here on their way to the barn with Peter Anderson's wheat and Carl Nelson's hay. On summer nights the children rolled their hoops along. Never before has anyone had to run for his life on this street. Rasmus runs down toward the sea, with Liff in hot pursuit. What is the boy going to do? Jump in? Liff increases his speed. There has to be an end to this right now. A dilapidated boat landing juts right out into the sea, and at the end of it is a half-collapsed boathouse. Rasmus runs out on the landing. It sways under him. It sways still more when Liff comes. But the gangster smiles triumphantly. The youngster is as good as caught. Running out on the landing was the most stupid thing he could have done. There is no way back. Now he's finished if he doesn't want to jump in and drown himself. At the boathouse, the landing makes a right angle. Rasmus keeps on running along the rickety planks. His shirt has come out of his pants during the chase, and a blue-striped shirt tail is the last thing Liff sees before Rasmus disappears behind the boathouse. The landing creaks ominously as Liff comes running. Now finally, that tough youngster will get what he deserves. Liff dashes after him around the corner of the boathouse. Suddenly, the pounding footsteps are no longer heard. Instead, there is a big splash. Mr. Liff doesn't even have time to shout before the salt waves wash over him. He tries, but only a little blop comes out. For a second, Rasmus is almost triumphant. Digging up potatoes wasn't the only thing he had learned at Vesterhaga. He also learned to trip up an enemy. Coughing and spitting, Lif comes to the surface in a blind rage. He scrambles up on the landing, and Rasmus, panic-stricken, realizes that he will never get away this time, but he is going to do his utmost. He is going to run until he collapses, but that won't be long now, because his heart is pounding as if it would burst. The chase goes back along the landing, along the village street, across Carl Nelson's front yard, and into Peter Anderson's. It's just like being pursued in a nightmare. Now he's in the lead, but his enemy is gaining on him. Relentless, sopping wet, ruthless. Rasmus will never make it. Peter Anderson's Potato Cellar. Rasmus has been down there before when he was playing at house hunting and was making believe that he had 50 sacks of potatoes to make potato fritters with. Completely at the end of his strength, he slips into the darkness of the cellar, hoping against hope that Lif isn't close enough to see him and won't think of looking here. It's a feeble little hope that quickly vanishes. He hears someone grab hold of the door handle, and here comes Lif, wet and raging at the urchin who dares to put him through all this. Blindly he plunges into the cellar, but at Vastahaga, Rasmus has also learned another trick. Many a time he would hide inside a door and when the pursuer dashed in, quickly jump out behind him. This is exactly what Rasmus does now. Lif hurtles past, and quick as a flash, Rasmus dodges out, bangs the cellar door, and turns the rusty key. Not until he hears Lif's terrible roars on the other side of the door does he realize what he has done. He has locked his enemy in Peter Anderson's old potato cellar. His legs are shaking. He is dead tired. He longs for Oscar, but perhaps Oscar is dead. As fast as he can, he runs back to his house. He approaches very cautiously. He doesn't know where Oscar is or where Leander is. It is already dawn. Soon the sun will rise over the Minnesota traveler's old village. Rasmus throws himself down on his stomach in the grass and inches over to the kitchen window. Slowly he gets up on his knees and peers through the windowless frame. Leander was standing with his back against the window, very close. Oscar was near the stove with his hands up. Leander was holding his gun and had Oscar's rucksack at his feet. "Shoot," said Oscar. "One hobo more or less in the world doesn't make any difference. You can just bet my fingers are itching to pull the trigger," Leander said. "But I don't want to disappoint the sheriff. He's out to get you for the Sandow robbery. Did you know that? And also for robbing Miss Hedberg. Did you know that? To think that there are swine like you in the world," said Oscar quietly. But if I should happen to tell the sheriff what kind of hoodlums you and Lif are." Rasmus' eyes filled with tears. He knew that the sheriff would never believe a tramp, and he knew that Oscar knew it too. Leander laughed a harsh, nasty laugh. "Yes, you just go ahead and try it. A while ago you seemed a little worried yourself," said Oscar. "You were afraid that Miss Hedberg would revive and testify to one thing and another. That Anna Steina has lied, for instance. Suppose the old lady revives, after all." "She won't," said Leander in a low voice. "After what has happened here tonight, I have a feeling that Miss Hedberg won't survive. Neither Anna Steina nor we can take that risk." Outside in the grass, Rasmus clenched his fists. Of all the gangsters in the world, Lif and Leander were the most ruthless. It sounded as if Leander had something horrible in mind when he said what he did about Miss Hedberg. "You big fool, the whole thing is your fault," Leander barked. "Why did you have to go and stick your oar in?" It will only serve you right when the sheriff locks you up. Don't take it too hard, though. Jails aren't so bad these days. You've probably spent enough time there to know," said Oscar. "And I'll do my best to see that you go back." "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought," said Leander. "Don't you see that you'll get there faster if you try to stick us? If you have any sense in your head, you'll get as far away from here as you can and keep your traps shut and never show your face around here again." "No, and never have a peaceful moment when I see a cop," said Oscar bitterly. "If I could understand how skunks like you and Liff can exist, what a pleasure it would be to knock you senseless." From his position outside the window, Rasmus nodded in agreement. How wonderful it would be if Oscar could mop up the floor with Leander. Oscar was as strong as a bull, much stronger than Leander, but Leander had his terrible gun, which he was aiming at Oscar. If it hadn't been for that, next to him on the ground was an old board. Without really knowing what he was doing, Rasmus picked it up and banged it with all his might against Leander's right elbow. Leander let out a bellow of pain and rage as the gun flew in a curve over the kitchen floor. With a shout of triumph, Oscar hurled himself on Leander, and they began to roll around on the floor. Rasmus watched, terrified, jumping up and down, and biting his knuckles to keep from crying. He had never been able to stand seeing people fight. This was no joke. Leander seemed to be just as strong as Oscar, and both men were grappling frantically for the gun. The gun! Rasmus suddenly came to life. Leander mustn't get hold of the gun. As fast as his trembling legs could carry him, Rasmus ran around to the door and into the kitchen. The whole floor was shaking with the fight that was going on. The men were thrashing around so that Rasmus could hardly find a place to step. Leander's hand kept reaching out for the gun. Rasmus kicked the horrible black weapon so that it flew into a corner. Then he picked it up with trembling hands, as if it were a poisonous snake. He could hardly bear to hold it, and he couldn't stand seeing and hearing those men thumping around and groaning and fighting. Still holding the gun, he ran out to the kitchen steps. He wanted to be sick, but he didn't have time. He just stood there crying and saw how the strong wind lashed at the branches of the birch trees. The sun had just come up beyond the island and was glittering on the crest of the waves. The seagulls had also started their day. They were circling over the old gray village and screeching as if they too were afraid. But probably only he was afraid, and so tired that all he wanted was to lie down and die. Oh yes, one thing more. He wanted to get rid of the gun. Sobbing, he ran over the cliffs. The wind was so strong that he could hardly stand up straight. When he reached the edge, he flung the gun into the sea, and a shiver of loathing went through his body. As soon as he had done it, he realized that it might have been the wrong thing to do. Oscar might need it to defend himself with, but it was too late now. The gun was down with the fish about 30 feet underwater, and there it would remain for all eternity. Rasmus dragged himself back from the edge of the cliff. There was Oscar coming toward him with his clothes and hair in wild disorder, his rucksack on his back, grim and triumphant at the same time. Rasmus wanted to cry still more, but he swallowed hard and forced back the lump in his throat. "Come on, let's go," said Oscar. "Leander?" asked Rasmus. "Leander is taking a little nap by the fireplace, but where is Liff?" "I locked him in the potato cellar," said Rasmus, exhausted. Oscar looked at him with a broad grin. "The king of the fighters," he said. "You are not scared of anything, are you?" "Yes, I'm terribly scared," said Rasmus, and he cried still more. Now Oscar would probably be angry with him, and if Liff got out, he would need the gun. But Oscar wasn't angry. He only nodded and said, "Everything is all right the way it is. You and I probably aren't much good at handling guns anyway, but now we'd better get a move on and get out of here." Rasmus moaned. He just couldn't get a move on. He looked pleadingly at Oscar. "There is only one thing I have strength enough for now, Oscar, and that is to sleep."